Hi everyone, my name is David Ryshpan, also known as Ryshgang, and we're going to talk about beat making and musicality here at Hip Hop You Don't Stop. I'm a pianist, composer, arranger, DJ, producer, and radio host here in Montreal. It's my honor to be part of the programming this year. And over the next hour in this workshop, we're going to talk about a little bit of music theory, mostly listening skills and thoughts and processes, just things to think about and focus on in order to improve your production skills and your communication skills with your fellow musicians. For those of you who don't know who I am and my artistic background, I'm a pianist. It's been 30 years that I've been playing piano and keyboards. I came up through the world of jazz and improvised music. My relationship to the hip hop community, especially in Montreal, began as a keyboardist working alongside producers like Think Twice, Jai Lotus, the Nomadic Massive Crew, the Calmunity Vibe Collective as well. And my entry into hip hop production was primarily in replaying samples for producers. And so I drew on my background as a formally trained jazz musician to be able to hear and copy what was going on in the samples I was being sent, both on a harmonic and technical level, as well as a sonic kind of level as well. As a member of the Calmunity Vibe Collective for the past 17 years, which is a weekly session of improvised Black American music, R&B, jazz, soul, hip hop, house, I've had to become familiar with the harmonic and sonic languages of all of these subgenres. So when I started to produce on my own, I came to the production game with all of this knowledge as a performer and keyboardist, a performer, improviser, and keyboardist. And I feel like a lot of that informs how I think about production, how I approach my production. And I'm going to share some of that with you today. Obviously, a very big question that I see a lot on the internet that I've spoken about on my YouTube channel is the idea of how much music theory do you need? What exactly do we mean by music theory? And kind of pushing back against this romanticization of not knowing music theory. If you've seen my previous video on this on my YouTube channel, I kind of get away from the common phrases, the common vocabulary of music theory and ear training. And I've moved towards these ideas of musical communication and musical perception. Musical communication, music theory, as a producer, as a beat maker, I personally feel like you don't necessarily need to know the Western classical theoretical terms to define what you're doing. Also, because tonal Western classical musical theory doesn't apply very well to Black American music. What I would encourage everybody to do, and what we're going to look at in this video, is focusing your listening and learning how to listen critically, and then applying terms and definitions and labels to the conclusions that you reach by your focused, active, critical listening. The point of music theory, as far as electronic music production goes, hip hop production goes, for me, is to have a shared vocabulary that you can use with your collaborators, with your colleagues, to share your ideas. If you have to communicate musical ideas, everyone should be on the same page, having the same terms, the same labels, the same vocabulary to share those ideas. The most efficient way often is to use the standard musical terminology. But if you are working with a closed crew of people, a fixed crew of collaborators, you can come up with your own terminology for it. As long as everyone in the group understands what you're talking about, then the theory terms, the jargon, is less important than reaching these goals, reaching these ideas, reaching these definitions. Often, as artists, as beat makers, as musicians, we resort to a kind of shorthand, and we often name drop artists or subgenres in terms of talking about those styles. What I would encourage you to do as an exercise is to really deconstruct what any of those artists and subgenres, any of those shortcuts really mean. What does Pete Rock sound like? What is the Jay Dilla swing? What is trap music? For you, what do you mean when you say, I want to make a trap beat? What kind of drum sounds are they using? What drum samples are they using? What kind of synthesizers are they using? And synth sounds are they using? What are the effects treatments? What's the balance of kick and bass in those styles? What kind of bass is it in that kind of music? Is it an electric bass? Is it a bass synth? Is it an 808? Coming up with all of these very clear, objective, quantifiable things make it much easier for me to go into a production because I understand the component parts of any given subgenre that I want to address, that I want to use. It also allows me to possibly create different fusions of styles because I can say to myself, I can make kind of a thought experiment or an elevator pitch of what happens if I mix this with that. And I know exactly what those components are. What happens if I mix WizKid drums with Benga sub bass? What happens if I mix old school boom bap drums with contemporary grime or trap synthesizers? What does that sound like? How can I flip this sample into a completely different realm than its original context? What is the most polar opposite type of beat that I could program and make to completely recontextualize this sample? And those are the same things I thought about when I was arranging for acoustic ensembles, whether it's a big band or a string quartet. What are the colors that are available to me? What is the traditional language of this ensemble? What is the level of the ensemble that I'm writing for? What is the role of each instrument in that ensemble? How can I play to their strengths? How can I subvert that? And knowing the repertoire or the way things are usually done, it's a case of knowing the rules to break the rules. In terms of focusing your listening, one thing that was very helpful to me as well in terms of learning synth programming is going back to these old 70s fusion records. Think of Early Weather Report, Headhunters, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and Return to Forever. Basically, at the beginning of the 70s, when synthesizers became much more popular and more common in recorded music, you would see individual credits for each synthesizer that was used on a record. I think of the back cover of Herbie Hancock's Sunlight, where he's surrounded by his fortress of keyboards, and each one of them is listed and named. What that helped me do was to isolate and learn to hear the sounds of each of those synthesizers, to understand what a Moog sounded like versus an ARP 2600 versus an Oberheim. And a lot of that information is out online. You can look up what synthesizers people used on the tracks that you love. And beyond harmony and traditional music theory, this is production theory for me. Understanding what was used on any given track, understanding how to capture the sound of the records you love, of the artists you love. And that's why I lean towards the phrase musical perception, because it's not just about training your ear as an abstract goal. The ear and the training of the ear is not the end in and of itself. We are training our ear to be able to hear and perceive the qualities of the music that we want to be making. If you walk away from this workshop with only one thing, I want to talk about the power of the semitone. The semitone is the distance from one piano key to the next key. It is the smallest Western equal tempered interval. And the treatment of semitones is really powerful in making your songs, your mixes, your beats sound harmonious or sound like there's a bunch of mistakes. I'm going to try to avoid the words bad and good, wrong or right, because music is so subjective. But in terms of dealing with semitones, the thing for me is intent. We're going to see some ways that dissonance and clashing semitones are used intentionally for effect. And then we're going to look at some things where if you didn't intend to have those dissonances, those semitones rubbing against each other, why it's not going to sound like you intended your track to sound. So to further explain this, here is a semitone. So if I play middle C on my keyboard, a semitone up would be C sharp or D flat. Back down to C, and then the semitone below it is B. So if I play those two notes together, so let's look at a couple of situations where the power of the semitone becomes very important. So let's talk about a C minor chord, a C minor triad. So a triad is a chord made up of 3 notes with a bass note or the root, a third, in this case a minor third, and then a fifth. A lot of blues and blues-derived music plays on the space between a minor third and a major third. So there's C minor. Here is C major. So the only difference between those two chords is the semitone that changes the quality of the third, that changes the type of third. Minor, major. Now in blues and blues-derived music, Black American music, there's these bends, or what some people now call the neutral third, which is somewhere between the minor and major third. On a keyboard, which is a tempered instrument, unless I had a pitch bend wheel somewhere here, I wouldn't be able to get that neutral third. The closest I can get on a piano is to slide. So that distance, that change between minor and major is a semitone. Where you need to be careful in constructing your chord progressions is to check out the clash between minor and major thirds. There's a very big difference between being bluesy and singing a clashing, conflicting third that doesn't fit the chord. If I play that minor chord in my left hand, and then I play a major third on top, maybe an octave or 2 octaves higher, that doesn't really sound bluesy or soulful. It sounds wrong. And these are the kinds of things that you want to learn to perceive, that you want to learn to hear. Now, if I flip it and I play a major chord in my left hand, and I play the minor third above it, that sounds a little bluesier, a little more soulful, a little more intentional. So we're going to look at a submission I did for Beat Brasilis or Loop Session Sao Paulo, and we're going to look at tuning multiple samples to each other. So one thing I like to do when I'm doing loop sessions is that I like to repitch certain things. I like to use samples from a lot of different tracks on the provided crate. You need to tune them to each other. Again, the power of the semitone. So you'll see that I've sampled 4 different things. This is just an intro and outro of this track. So you see I have 4 different tracks of samples. This is actually a series of samples that I brought into EXS. These 2 bars are the main loop of the track. And what it is that I created a new chord progression out of it. You'll see that I've transposed this bar of the sample up 4 semitones. And then I've transposed this bar of the sample down -1 semitone. So I've created a new chord progression that my bass track is now following. So my bass is playing A to G sharp, because the chords that I've kind of implied now with manipulating these samples so I've created this chord progression of A major 7 with a flat 5, going to G sharp minor 7. And I've created that entirely new chord progression just based on manipulating 2 bars of the sample by pitching one up 4 semitones and pitching the next bar down 1 semitone. So if I undo the tuning, this is what the original sample chop sounds like. So very different. Now if I put the tuning back, so now I've decided on my harmony. Now this doesn't necessarily have to be a sample. This could be chords that you created on your own. But now I have decided that that's my progression for the verse or whatever section of the tune that might be. So now anything else I add into those chord progressions needs to fit those chords, needs to be in tune with those chords. So I added the bass to just kind of solidify the harmony. So what you might hear is that in the low end of the sample, in the low end of the loop, there's also a low C sharp. So the original bass note would have been, or the original bass note, even though I've tuned it, there's a C sharp. That still works in the A major chord. Once again, the chord that we're dealing with is this. So here's my bass note, and here's the C sharp. So they still work together. I added also a piano track just to reinforce the harmony even more. So now let's look at what these other hey interjections are, and we're going to see, if you look here, that I've retuned them as well. So now I've pitched these heys up. This one's up by +7, which is a perfect fifth. This one is not transposed because it was in the key I needed it to be in. And this one is the same. This is the same. It's up +7. So if I just solo these, so you'll also hear that chord in the background that I took is now matching that A major chord. And now this upcoming little sample. Let's break down what that melodic fragment is. So whenever you're putting samples together, whenever you're putting parts together, you should know what the notes are. So those notes B, C sharp, D sharp, E. Now, if you already have a bass line and you're trying to fit this sample over your bass line, just simply check how those notes sound to you over your bass note. So already I see that from the orchestral loop that we looked at before, so the C sharp and the D sharp are also in this other vocal sample. And then that sample also works over the G sharp, because if I play the notes of the orchestral loop, I have the B and I have the D sharp. So I can put that sample over either chord that I've set up in this loop. I can play it over the A, or I can play it over the G sharp. By contrast, that first hey sample, which is very much an A major sound, if I put that over the G sharp in the bass, it's okay, but we have this tension, this conflict between the A on top and the G sharp in the bass. Now, if you like that sound and you intend to use that sound, that's cool. Go ahead and use it. But that is a sound that exposed semitone, that exposed displaced semitone. And I say exposed because I have the bass note and I have the melody note. You can also call them outer voices. Those are the things you hear the most, the bass and the melody, right? So if those notes are a semitone apart, especially with the bass being the lower semitone, That's a sound to use with extreme caution and extreme intent. If I flip those around like I have in our first chord, that's actually also, it's the same semitone, except I flipped the order of the A and the G. Now the A is in the bass and the G sharp is on top. I just want you to compare those two sounds. G sharp in the bass with A on top. A in the bass, G sharp on top. Now I'm going to play the chords that are associated with those outer voices. So here's G sharp in the bass, A on top with the chord in the middle. Now I'm going to play the chord that is the orchestral loop, the A with the G sharp on top and the chord in the middle. And now I'm going to play that same chord that I played over the G sharp bass note, but I'm going to play A in the bass. So here's G sharp in the bass. And here's A in the bass. Same thing in the right hand. So let's hear these samples in context with the loop and the bass. No drums so that we can really hear what's going on. Now, again, the power of the semitone. This phrase, this amigo sample, actually starts on a semitone. It goes from A to G sharp. Now, this is what I've been talking about, intent and addressing dissonance with intent. So it's a dissonant interval, but then it resolves itself downward to the root of the melody. So the melody's going A, G sharp, and my bass line's also going A, G sharp, and everything in the track is going A, G sharp. So it's just following the same movement that I have throughout the rest of the track, but just doing it a little bit later. It doesn't hang on the A, it doesn't stay on the dissonant note, and it doesn't resolve to another dissonant note. It goes from a dissonant note, it goes from the semitone up down to the bass note. One more time, just listen to this, amigo. So we're going to look at this little beat, this little trappy, dubsteppy kind of vibe, and we're going to look at the kick specifically in relationship to the rest of the synths. The key of this track is G minor. Okay, so that's the vibe. This kick is not particularly long in terms of the sample, and it doesn't have a very long decay. So the pitch of the kick, it's not like a pitched 808. There is a pitch to it, so let's check what the actual pitch is. So I'm working on headphones right now, so my trick to really check the note of a kick of an 808 is to just pitch it up an octave so that I can hear the note. Okay, so now let's go find that note on the keyboard. That note would be sorry for the extra hi-hats. My keyboard is controlling the kit as well, so it's an A flat or a G sharp. So again, we have this thing of a semitone. Because the decay is short, let me play the track again. You don't really hear the note of it quite as much. However, now that it's up an octave and more audible, you do hear it. Okay, it's not terrible. It still kind of works. For my ears, it would work if it were tuned to a note in a G minor chord, particularly if it were a G. So I'm going to bring this down. A flat is 1 semitone higher than G. So now instead of it being up an octave, 12 semitones, I'm going to bring it to 11 semitones. Now it's a G. So let's play it. And I'm just going to exaggerate this. I'm going to make the decay longer, and I'm going to make the hold longer. Let's see what this sounds like now. Okay, so now we hear a little bit more of the note, and now that it's G, everything to my ears seems more balanced. So making sure that things are in tune is not just a question of harmony and being theoretically and harmonically correct. It's also a question of sound and production, because every sound, especially if they're low, each sound generates overtones or harmonics. And when we work with EQ, what we're doing is we are controlling the harmonics of any given sound. So if our kick is in tune with the rest of our beat, all of a sudden the mix feels like it's clearer and cleaner and more united. Not because I did anything, I haven't changed any compression, I haven't EQ'd this kick differently. It's just I've changed the tuning, and now the tuning sits with the rest of my track. So now I'm going to drop this back down. So 11 semitones minus an octave means -1. So here we go. Now it's back in kick range, and we're going to listen to this beat with the retuned kick. Okay, it's a subtle difference, but it's a difference nonetheless. Let me put this kick sample back up to 0, and we're going to listen to it again. So this is the original pitch. And now down a semitone. Change of costume, change of scenery. I'm here at La Casona with the Hip Hop You Don't Stop crew. This is the second half of the Ryshgang workshop. So in the first half, I have talked about some different examples of what I'm listening for when I'm preparing remixes and productions. And now we're going to dive into a remix that I did of Deidre, It Goes On, for the Loop Sessions competition. And we're going to walk step by step through my process, the things I'm listening for, the way I program things, the way I came up with the chord progressions, and all of that. So what we got sent as part of the Loop Sessions competition for this remix was just the a cappella, just the vocals. So let's take a listen to just the vocals.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. 'Cause now I know that you make me wanna run away. I see those demons in your eyes. Your spell has got me mesmerized, but I can't say that you didn't try me anyway. It goes on and 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 on. Can't take you much longer, much longer, much longer, much longer, much longer, lonely, 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 lonely.
All right, so that's the a cappella. And the first step when you're working with an a cappella, when I'm working with an a cappella, is to find the key that it's in. We weren't sent an instrumental for this. We weren't sent instrumental stems for this either, so we only have the a cappella. So the first step is to find the key that it's in, and this particular track, this a cappella, has that kind of droning, held note, so that helps. So let's find that note. Let's find that note.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. 'Cause now I know that you make me wanna run away.
Okay, so what I'm hearing in that melody is the melody is outlining G minor. The only trick with this melody that kind of forces your hand harmonically a little bit, at least in my opinion, is that Deidre's turnaround, the phrase at the end of the verse, kind of hangs out on an A, which means that kind of phrase sends you back to the top of your form. And whatever harmony you decide to use for your remix, for your production of this vocal, needs to kind of support that A at the end of the phrase. So that's your kind of, I don't want to call it a limitation, but that's something that you have to address in the chords and the harmony you decide to create around this vocal. So we're working in the universe of G minor. So again, going back to this idea of the power of the semitone, the chords I'm going to choose are going to most likely have G in them somewhere, and I'm going to avoid, you know, harmonizing everything on like an F sharp or an A flat. I don't want to be a semitone away from the melody unless I'm kind of doing jazzy chords where those semitones are covered by other voices. So I'll show you what I mean. If I just play that melody over an F sharp in the bass, you're going to hear how not great it sounds. Again, I'm going to avoid saying right and wrong, bad and good, but hopefully you will hear and perceive that it's not the most supportive bass note to have for that melody. I mean, if you like that sound, that can be your style and your choice, but I would say 90% of producers would not intentionally make that choice. So here I'm going to play that melody over a G bass note. Sounds like it makes a lot more sense. Now, here's the little wildcard thing. I'm going to play it over an A flat or a G sharp bass note, and it won't sound as completely out as it did over the F sharp, but what I have to do is I have to add some notes in between to make it make sense over the A flat. So here's that. So it works for some of the melody, it doesn't work for some of the other melody. So we're going to say that we're in the world of G minor, and a lot of the chords we're going to choose are in that universe of G minor. They belong to G minor. They are related to G minor, whatever terminology you want to use for that. So my first instinct, actually, for this, I really like when the tune is in minor and the melody is very much in minor. I really like the movement of, in this particular key, E flat major 7 to G minor, which is basically G minor with E flat in the bass, and then G minor with G in the bass. So that sounds like this. Now, like I said, the end of Deidre's phrases ends on an A natural. So my first instinct was to harmonize that with an A minor. So I'm like, okay, now I have 3 chords. It's a 4-bar phrase, so I should have a 4th chord so that I have like 1 chord per bar. So my first instinct was to play this.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. 'Cause now I know that you make me wanna run away. I see those demons in your eyes. Your spell has got me mesmerized, but I can't say that you didn't try me anyway. It goes.
Which is great, and the reason why it's great is because it's Golden Lady by Stevie Wonder. So then the wheels start turning. It's like, how do I keep the things that I like about that progression, but then change it so I'm not stealing from Stevie Wonder? I should also mention that part of my initial process, like I spoke about in the first part, is as soon as I hear the a cappella, I'm giving myself kind of a sonic palette to work from. So when I heard the a cappella, my first instinct was to kind of go full on boogie voyage fantastique on it. As I started working, creating harmonies and preparing drum sounds, I realized that going full boogie at 90 BPM wasn't really working for me. So what ultimately happened though was that because I was working in this kind of 80s retro soundscape, that's what let me kind of focus in on certain drum samples that I chose, certain keyboard patches that I chose. And now when I listen back to it, it's kind of like if Prince and Sade had a baby instead of being full on, roller disco boogie. But even just that initial impression of I want this to be kind of 80s boogie Minneapolis inspired, let me narrow down what kick sound I'm going to use, what snare sound I'm going to use, what synth patches I'm going to use, and I'm not wasting a ton of time going through all 1,000 snare samples that I have on my hard drive. I already kind of know that I'm looking for Oberheimy kind of synths, DMX and 707 drum kits. I might change it to kind of update it or take it out of that universe a little bit intentionally, but already going in, I can dial in a couple of bass sounds that I think might work, a couple of synth sounds that I think might work, Rhodes sounds that might work, drum kits that might work, and then go back once I've drafted ideas and change it later. So let's listen to the chord progression that I ultimately settled on, and we'll take a look at what's going on. And I'm going to still play it without the drums so that we can really hear the harmony.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. 'Cause now I know that you make me wanna run away. I see those demons in your eyes. Your spell has got me mesmerized, but I can't say that you didn't try me anyway.
Okay, so before we go into the chorus, let's analyze the verse. So the first chord is E flat major 7, like I started on before. You could also consider that G minor with E flat in the bass. And then I go to G minor with G in the bass. Then I go to C minor, which is like our E flat chord, but with C in the bass. And then I go to our A minor, and I add a D7 after it. So now that's straight from Golden Lady. That turnaround is exactly what happens in Golden Lady. So that's my nod to Stevie Wonder there, but the rest is different. And then do it twice because the verse is 8 bars, and then let's see what's going on in the chorus.
It goes on and 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 on. Can't take you much stronger, much longer, much longer, much longer, much lonely, 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 lonely.
Okay, the chorus is a little more complicated, and the chorus is kind of starting where we started harmonically in the verse and going a little bit away from where we were. We're still in the world of G minor. Everything still works and kind of belongs to G minor. But we're looking at the G. Think of taking the G note, and we're going to look at it, take it like a pool ball or a golf ball or basketball, and we're going to turn it around and we're going to look at it from different sides. So this is where theory can be helpful, because if you find yourself painted into a corner, it's like, okay, G minor, I might only hear certain chords that relate to G minor. I might only have that level of perception of what I actually hear in my head without going to a keyboard and calculating things. But with theory, what we can do is we can think of every possible way that we can harmonize G, right? So we have G minor. What happens if I put the G over an A flat? A flat major 7. What happens if I put G over an A? A minor. What happens if I put G over B flat? B flat major with the 6. So that's what theory can help you do, is find these other ways that you wouldn't necessarily hear on your own, but you can add that to your palette because you're thinking about it. And then once you think about it, I compare it to learning a second or third language. You learn the grammar, and of course you're still translating in your head, and you're thinking about it, and you're trying to use that new word that you just learned in a conversation, but ultimately once you become more comfortable with it, it just comes out in your conversation. So I'll play the chord progression, and because I'm holding the mic, I will explain what the chord progression is after. So we have E flat, and then D minor, and then to our home, which is G minor. Now that move, those 3 chords, is about 90% of R&B. Just the 2 of Us, What You Won't Do for Love, everything that's sampled, those 2 tunes, that progression is everywhere. And then where do I go? I go to A flat major. And it's the first time we really hear something out of the key or out of the progression that I've installed before. So that move is really interesting to the listener. It's like, oh, we've gone somewhere. This feels like a chorus because it's different now. And then I kind of flip back and forth between E flat, A flat. And then instead of resolving the chorus to G minor, I go to D minor. And then our last chord to head back to the verse is B flat 7, but suspended fancy chord. It's basically, I don't want to make it sound like a big, I don't want it to sound like that. So how do I kind of hide it a little bit? We use what are called suspended chords with no third. Again, you don't need to necessarily know the name of it. You could call it the Rock With You chord. Right? And just call it, okay, my last chord is B flat Rock With You. Again, you don't necessarily need the perfect theoretical terminology. You need to perceive and understand the sounds that you're hearing. So I think that's enough on harmony. Let's get into the drums. I'm going to mute the other synths for now. We'll talk about synths in a second. So here are my drums. And if you tuned into the first part of the workshop, you know I use Native Instruments Battery to program my drums. I really like Battery. It took me a long time to learn it, but now I've learned it, and that's just what I use. So here's drums and vocals.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. 'Cause now I know that you make me wanna run away. I see those demons in your eyes. Your spell has got me mesmerized, but I can't say that you didn't try me anyway. It goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Can't take it much longer, much longer, much longer, much longer, much lonely, 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 lonely. You thought that.
All right, so I think if I remember my process, what I generally do these days for remixes is I'll start, if I'm starting from an a cappella, I'll start with a scratch chord progression, a scratch Rhodes or piano track. And then I will maybe program some scratch drums. Then I'll play a bass line. Then I'll fix my keyboards. Then I'll fix my drums. Then I'll add all the effects and transitions and stuff. So it's kind of, I'm always going back and forth and always revising things, because as I fix one thing, as I change one thing, that changes how the groove is going to feel, that changes how the drum arrangement is going to feel, that changes maybe what synth sound I'm going to ultimately choose, that changes where the solo goes maybe. So I think, like I said, because I had intended to make it like really boogie, I probably started with the chorus drums. Which works great for the chorus, but it doesn't work. It didn't work to me for the verse. The first verse especially needs to start somewhere lower for the chorus to feel like it lifts. So that's why the claps and the snares are only on beat 4.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. 'Cause now I know that you make me wanna run away.
And it's rim shot, actually.
I see those demons in your eyes. Your spell has got me mesmerized, but I can't say.
So now when the
that you
full
didn't
drums
try
come
me
in, it
anyway.
feels like, oh, this is really the
It
chorus.
goes on and 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 on. Can't.
And that's a technique that if you watch real drum set drummers, they will use a lot in the way that they build their grooves. They'll start the first verse with the cross stick or the rim shot or the side stick, and then the first chorus is where they introduce the open snare, and then maybe the second verse, it's the same groove as the first verse, but the snare is open again. And all these little dynamic shifts that are what makes sections lift, that the great arrangers understood, the great producers understood, and even the great hip-hop producers I compare the great hip hop producers to the great orchestrators and the great arrangers. I compare great hip hop producers to great arrangers and orchestrators because they have that same understanding of orchestration and dynamics, especially when they're working with vocalists and rappers and kind of orchestrating the different verses, what each MC, if you're on a posse track or you have multiple MCs on a track, how are you going to frame each MC a little bit differently, especially if you only have a loop. So let's add this percussion track. I'm not sure what this percussion track is actually.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All
Yes.
by myself, I don't need a man. It's not I don't. But you make me wanna run away. I see those.
So that percussion track, I'll just play it on its own actually. So that's my little escape hatch from being fully in the Minneapolis sound. As I was producing it, this is probably added much later in the process. But as I was working on this remix, I'm like, the verse still needs something, because if I play the verse without that part, it sounds like this. I play the verse without that part, it sounds like this.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. It's not I don't. But you make me wanna run away. I see.
Which, it's fine. It's fine. But it's missing something. It's missing something specifically above Deidre's voice and above my Rhodes. And those percussion sounds for me are what kind of bring it into, I think of it as like a modern take on Sade.
Fly me to Paris and Japan. All by myself, I don't need a man. It's not I don't. But you make me wanna run away.
And it's high enough that it's out of the way of my Rhodes, it's out of the way of Deidre's voice, it's away from a lot of the rest of the drums too, so it's living in its own space, frequency-wise. And then what's this third perk track? Let's see what this is.
It's not I don't. But you make me wanna run away. I see.
Something just to give some life to the rim shot, because the rim shot on its own is kind of a low mid, kind of nasal rim shot. I like having tambourines on my rim shots, especially when it's the only thing happening in the drums. All right, how am I doing on time? I got a little bit of time left, so let's look at synthesizers. So synth patches, I think, are where you really define the era of your track, what your influences are, what subgenre you're trying to hit. And like I said before, I was very much thinking Prince, Minneapolis, which translates technically and historically to Oberheim synths, specifically kind of synth brass. And at the time that I programmed this track, that I produced this track, I was watching Anomalie's streams on Twitch, and he talked about a technique that he uses where he'll have similar sounds. He kind of treats his synths the way a lot of producers treat vocal stacks. So you'll have one sound on the left, another sound on the right, and then a sound in the center. And they're all just a little bit different. And they're playing the same part, they're not playing different parts. They're playing the exact same thing, but they're panned left, right, center on different sounds. So I'll just play the synth stabs that I have in the verse here. Just the synth stabs. Here we go. Pretty simple, and it's a simple part. All it's doing is following the chords of the roads. Yeah, I'm on the wrong sound. It's following the chords of the chorus. But I'm thinking of voicing them like a horn section. I'm thinking of it like a 4-piece horn section. So I'm trying to make each note in the chords lead to each other. So if you look, the melody note is walking down the scale, D, C, B flat. And all the other 3 supporting voices are moving in consequence of that melody. Again, do you need to know that that's called voice leading? Maybe, maybe not. You should just be able to perceive that I'm not jumping between different positions. I'm trying to lead my chords, lead my synth brass stepwise from one note to the next. Again, the terminology and getting caught up in the jargon is not the most important aspect here. The most important aspect is being able to hear, oh, that sounds like Prince style synth patches. That sounds like a good way, or the way I intend to voice my horn stabs. And so in terms of the programming, one side of that is the Arturia OBXA. And the other side of it is the Waves element, which I feel like the Waves synthesizers, the Waves plugins, not the Waves mixing plugins, but they're synths. I feel like those are very underrated, and I'm giving you my secret weapon because I don't see anybody else using the Wave synths yet. Feel free to download them and try them. So here's the Waves side, the element side. And again, on its own, it sounds terrible because it's filling out what's not there in the OBX, right? I'll A-B them again. Here's the OBXA. It's very dull, very retro, not a lot of top, not a lot of bite, very kind of mid. And then the Waves, the element, I've cut out all of the bottom end, and it's just aggressive top end bite that the OBX doesn't have. Sounds terrible on its own, but you put the two together, and it has that roundness of the OBXA with the attack and the punch of the Waves. Let's hear that in the context of the whole track. Right? And then to level it up and make it lift when the chorus comes back, I added a third layer that's very much in the center from this is from Ultra Analog, made by Applied Acoustic Systems right here in Montreal. Not sponsored by any of these companies, if they want to. And again, the AAS stuff I find can be a little bit thin on its own, but when you start to blend it and layer it with other plugins, it sounds amazing. So here's the AAS, the Ultra Analog layer on its own. Okay, and now in the part 2, I've added this other, this kind of shot, this response to Deidre's vocals that wasn't there in the first chorus. So here's the second chorus with all 3 synth parts. I'm just going to play through to the bridge because I really like Deidre's melody in the bridge. And the bridge in an arrangement in a track should always be kind of really taking you away from what you've set up in the previous parts of the song, so that when you come back to the chorus, you feel like you've really gone somewhere. So here's the bridge. So I'm not going to break down each individual chord, but the mentality of that section is to have longer chords, more mellow synth pads, to really make it feel kind of dreamy and get away from the energy of the chorus, so that when the energy of the chorus comes back, it really has that impact. The drums are also completely different than the other sections of the tune. So I'm just going to play the drum programming of the bridge just to show that for me, everything has to work together, and this comes from my background in arranging for big bands and other acoustic ensembles, and working with drummers, working with rhythm section players, that when you change what's happening harmonically and vocally, the rhythm section also supports those changes. So here's the drums for the bridge just on its own. Different kick pattern. And I'm going to put Deidre's vocals over it because I think I did most of this programming just listening to her vocal phrasing. The way she leans into beat 4. All right, so I'm just going to play the bridge to the chorus to sign off of this workshop. Thank you so much to Hip Hop You Don't Stop for having me. It is an honor and a pleasure to be part of this programming. You can find me on every social media platform at Ryshpan Music. You can find my first mixtape, Ryshgang Volume 1, on wherever you purchase or also stream your music. And Volume 2 is coming very soon, I promise. So here's the bridge and the chorus of Deidre's It Goes On, the Ryshgang remix.